Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Nasher 360 Speaker Series. Now that summer is winding down, we're excited to bring you a fantastic fall lineup of speakers, beginning with today's guest, Philip Beesley, who we present in collaboration with our friends at the Ad Astra Lecture Series of the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History at the University of Texas at Dallas. Philip Beesley's work lies at a fascinating crux of sculpture and architecture, tradition and technology. Classically trained as a sculptor under the guidance of late abstract expressionists, Beesley went on to study architecture, seeking a means to frame the work he envisioned. Today, Beesley's Toronto-based practice, PBAI, is widely cited in the rapidly expanding technology of responsive and interactive architecture, and his Living Architecture Research Group, comprised of artists, architects, engineers, and scientists, is responsible for installations that incorporate cutting-edge materials with advanced learning technologies, creating structures that react to and evolve with the movements of people who pass through them, thus marrying material and space. Beesley is also a professor in the School of Architecture at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, where he serves as director for the Integrated Group for Visualization, Design, and Manufacturing, and as director for the Riverside Architectural Press. He has authored and edited 8 books and appeared on the cover of Artificial Life, Leonardo, and AD journals. His work was selected to represent Canada at the 2010 Venice Biennale for Architecture, and he has been recognized by the Prix de Rome in Architecture, Vita 11.0, the Far Eastern International Digital Design Awards, the Governor General's Awards, Architizer A+ Art Awards, and as a Caterva finalist. I'm eager to see what he has to share, so please join me now in welcoming Philip Beesley.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to see you here. I must say it's really quite an extraordinary experience to be finally at the Nasher, a legendary space among sculptors and architects, and the sense of the finely tuned light that's in the chambers upstairs is almost an unparalleled experience. What a beautiful, beautiful space that you have here among you. I'm going to try and share some questions that I'm asking myself, and I hope you'll be willing to go with me as I speak with you for the next hour or so in exploring some new qualities of space. The kind of questions that I ask myself are, what is the ground that I am standing on? What are the qualities of the world that wrap around me now, today, in this time that seems so very different than the solid ground that held us and supported us in our historical past, when we could rely on the firmity of the ground, when we could rely on the integrity of nature. What kind of ground do we stand on today? How might we frame it? How might we contribute a new environment? What kinds of relationships might we spin that might be renewing and fertile? The group that I now work with is a collaborative group which is tremendously optimistic about those kind of questions, even if sometimes we're rendered rather speechless with the sense of gravity, of instability that wraps around us in the world. And I hope I can earn some optimism by sharing some of the work, some of the sheer involved craft that we are involved in today. I'm going to organize this talk by giving you just some very brief outlines, such as a taste of the kind of environments. Here's one very recent one in Seoul, kind of deeply interlaced amalgam, and some more some older environments which are quite immersive. I'm going to be moving through some references to spaces as well, complex weather-like spaces. And I'm going to be trying to situate that also with some art historical references, such as this lovely Fra Angelico, this sense of this deep textile environment that might serve as a kind of model for architecture. I'm also going to try to touch on some dimensions of feeling and of the psyche, exploring a sense of transitional objects, of an expanded kind of physiology that might serve to bridge gaps in between people and between ourselves and nature. I'm going to try and talk also about some technical craft, using high-definition thermal sensing, tuning the industrial design of the elements. And above all, I'm going to try and share a sense of touch and intimacy and connection. Let me just very quickly run through some examples of the environments before I talk more about some of the ideas that are underlying them. Some early work was Hylozoic soil. Hylozoic is a lovely word. Hylozoic means life from material, an ancient Greek concept, but something that's very, very real and immediate today as we learn to address and to manipulate and to find new subtle phenomena by working very directly with material qualities. Here you can see some of the immersive environments that we've been doing in this past decade, and some quite public spaces. This was a very happy veil that was installed in Toronto in the Calatrava atrium. Included in those hovering, immersive, dissolving kinds of environments has increasingly been layers of metabolism, of active chemical exchange and active computation of many microprocessors running through and speaking to each other and imparting a kind of reflex and intelligence and response that starts to make a very, very lively exchange between ourselves and the environments. If we come into an environment like this is one that was installed in Mexico about 7 years ago. At first, the atmosphere is very quiet, ghost-like, basket-like crystalline columns, hovering, clad with the gentlest of veils. And then as we move closer and pass by, there might be a slow ripple of response, of very gentle flexing and moving, as if a wave or as if parting branches are breathing and moving past us. The embedded computation in this work tries to be very quiet and gentle. It's very different than the kind of amplification that a motor or a gear or a weapon might give us. Instead, the attempt is to impart a sense of breathing, ambient, quiet reflex, emplacing us. Here's an example of work in Seoul that was installed just a couple of years ago, which has become increasingly intense as the interconnections of computation and sensing and actuation have generated an almost flesh-like kind of weave of materials, laid over again with metabolic chemistries as well. Here we're just backing away from that reef-like environment so you can start to see the scale of it. This becomes a chamber that's a little smaller than the room that we're standing in here. You might be able to see the scale a little bit more by the figure here. So this work is intensely technical, but it does frame public space. And I hope that you might be able to go with me in seeing this as a kind of prototypical architecture. Certainly not an architecture of absolutely clear boundaries, but rather, if we bundled these layers together, we might start to see canopies and walls and chambers for gathering. Backing away within the same space, the initial chamber is framed by weather-like clouds of dissipative, very gentle filigrees that expand and hover and that take very, very slight motions imparted by our own movements moving through the space. So there's a delicate kind of trembling, a resonance that happens in these spaces. It's founded on a sense of touch and intimacy, a very comfortable, almost deliberate fragility, imparting the materials with resonant trembling, far from equilibrium, kind of calibration. Some of the elements are shot through with computation using small microprocessors in subsumptive loops. A subsumptive loop is something like, say, the organization of your nerves where you have a ganglion at your elbow, a funny bone, or in your knee, and so that there are reflex loops that happen that don't simply go to a central brain, but rather are chained together in many, many tribes. This work is also framed by a very deliberate kind of intimacy in which things are deliberately thinned down so that things can touch and poke and bristle and push back. Some of the detailing is unapologetically emotional. Rather than making things fit in silent ways, as if a joint simply has a job to do, the attempt is to make each piece have a certain kind of emotional relationship of clutching or grasping or perhaps fusing together in a kind of a happy communal embrace. The kind of tension and the flux that moves back and forth produces a kind of unabashedly tectonic emotional relationship in which we perch and push and pull towards something, or perhaps we're revolted as well, perhaps we pull away, perhaps things get tense enough almost to be a kind of a rictus or a great anxiety. The kind of emotional terrain of detailing is something that we're thoroughly enjoying. Those layers of work then, the basket-like textile structures, the distributed computation, some amounts of liquid chemistry, are worked together into increasingly symphonic environments, such as the Venice Biennale environment that you see here, in which there are chorus-like layers, weather-like layers that gather together. I hope that you can see some of the qualities of that work by looking at this short film. As you move through the space then, there are hyperbolic meshworks, that is doubly curved meshworks that stretch above you to make a structure. Those are laid over by glands and traps, imparting a soil-like fertility to all of those scaffolds. And then those are quietly shot through with layers of embedded computation in order to make a sensing environment that receives and tracks and moves with you. You can see some of the mechanisms here, which are quite different than motors and gears. They use shape memory alloy, using small currents that impart contractions and flexing and shifting. And the tuning of this material produces a kind of a vibration, a deliberate moire. Some of the motions that occur are deliberately gentle, breathing, small flexing, amplifying out into the space, using pneumatics and using different motors and gears. You can just see the slightest hint of tone that's affected by this work. So it's not, strictly speaking, a robotic environment. It's more of a gentle, breathing tone setter, a tuning. When we move close to the work, such as in these breathing pores that are laid out in this great quilt, then there are chains of motion that race outward and that produce great fields of turbulence, accompanied by some chirping and some whispering and acoustic resonances as well. And this sense of every surface being deliberately unstable, unapologetically fragile and resonant, produces quite a different design sense. Certainly one that's rather different than the design ethics as an architect that taught me to make stable, firm, clear, bounded figures. It moves rather quickly into an emotional realm. In this field that was installed in Muncie, Indiana, about 6 years ago, there is a whole field of gentle bamboo feathers with air muscles arranged in arrays above. And it's tuned for very primary emotional organizations. If you move quickly through the field, then it's interpreted as hostile and the elements will tense up. If you move very gently, then the same elements will slow down and will gently come to rest. And that seemed like a pretty good idea, right? You know, I mean, it would be interesting to have a beautiful emotional environment. The kind of devastating reaction that I found, though, was that the tuning between those realms was devilishly difficult, and the rebounding back and forth was such that it was as if we'd made an environment that was permanently ambivalent and paranoid and perhaps mentally ill. So if you just will stay with me in this very brief survey, I'm not identifying individual projects right now. I'm trying to give you just a feeling for a range of work. You can see that the organization is one of computationally derived scaffolds, quite carefully tuned, using digital fabrication that makes a fundamental textile-like structure. Now, woven into those is a whole manifold of glassworks, which then has liquid chemistries let into them, seeking to invest this work with a primary kind of synthetic metabolism, Certainly not the kind of active metabolism of our own bodies where we would have lymph or blood, but perhaps something that captures something of the qualities of exchange. I'll just run through a little bit of the examples of the liquid chemistries that are at work here. This is a Traub cell. Dr. Traub is a late 19th century researcher that was trying to model the action of an amoeba. And this is potassium ferric cyanide and copper sulfate working together. This is how those kind of chemistries are organized. This is an example from the Venice installation at the Venice Biennale, in which there was a whole layer of active filters, and then Venice water was gently trickled through it in order to process the water and carbon and capture carbon, a kind of a breathing processing. You can see some of the chemistries up close, such as this lovely Traub cell here that sits inside the glass flask, and I'll try and give you a feeling for the kind of dynamic that happens in the flasks with this short loop. So there's a copper sulfate crystal, and then a ferric salt is blooming out, pumped osmotically by the combination of those chemicals. And as it pumps, it gently fissures, and the breaks in it impart more fresh chemical in, and that results in this lovely kind of reticulated, efflorescing, very, very delicate skin-making exercise. And this produces a sense of generation of a new veil that right now is housed in multiple flasks, but is acting like a kind of prototypical seed formation that could move outside of those flasks and could cloak the entire environment, a little bit like an ivy cloaking a building, perhaps. Here you can see some more of the dynamics that we're exploring. This is a lovely collaborator, Rachel Armstrong, now in Newcastle, and working with synthetic biologists there. And here you can see some of the work that we have just moving outside of those flasks. There's good reason for them, for the things being in the flasks right now, because they're sticky messes. I mean, there's kind of disasters of sculptures in open spaces. But being able to make these strands through that chemistry and looking at the possibility of artificial skin making and cloaking the work just has such a kind of motivation to it that we're really very dedicated to working more in this way. You can see some of the strands that excuse me, that we're able to make. And then that spins together into these large dissolving reefs, such as the chamber that I was showing you in Seoul just a moment ago. In Seoul, you can see some of the design work that goes in preceding the material fabrication that we use, such as the rather patient assembly of individual elements, stretching, working, amassing, very much like a textile craft artist might work, or perhaps a mason. A kind of patient activity. I'm going to show you a little bit more of the Seoul Epiphyte chamber work, just to give a sense of how that liquid chemistry, which we can see here in the flasks, is woven into the whole amalgam of the fields that make this sculpture. So here we can see a grotto-like set of chambers made of manifolds of many, many layers of connected glasswork. That then is stimulated by LEDs in order to stimulate the growth of the protocells that are housed within the vessels. And in turn, all of those stimulators are chained together and activated by space sensors that track your own motions. Framing the work as a whole is the resonating outer clouds which hold vessels, and then at the center of the work is a much more intense, bristling network of tentacles, making a whole field that responds gently to you as you pass by. Here you can see the individual lashes of the tentacles gently moving and shifting in response to people passing by. This work has internal power in the form of vinegar batteries, vinegar powering copper and aluminum electrodes that make tiny little trace currents that then are used for triggering choruses of very gentle sound and also used as triggers for the motion as well. And so there's a sense of a highly, highly reactive environment which has its own internal impulses moving autonomically, as well as a response to you as well, moving through it. A mutual kind of back and forth conversation then a very, very gentle kind of sense of inhabiting a live world. Here we are just looking at some of those individual elements, the tentacles, and you can see just a little bit of the very simple craft we use, where we work with polymer sheeting and silicon and glassware, and then simple mechanisms such as shape memory alloy, nickel titanium alloy, which can stretch and contract under current. And this produces then a very kind of curious, rather delicious sense, I think, of emplacement, of standing not in a solid world, but rather somehow in something that almost comes alive. The sense that it is artificial is most certainly part of the experience, a kind of poignant sense of presence about to body forth, seeming ready to be named as something living, not in a presuming sense, not in a claiming sense of trying to organize and trying to have territory, but rather in a very hopeful sense of working with automated processes, working very deliberately, working with multiple sources of self-renewing systems that start to refresh the environment, start to move empathetically with you, start to have emotional cycles as well, start to have a sense of touch and intimacy. And perhaps when those layers start to come together, perhaps we could start to name them as living. This sense of working this way has such a curiously different approach than a classical education in architecture. And before I try to move too eagerly away from that preceding sense, I guess I want to just dwell on it for a moment. The sense of firmitas. Vitruvius, the Roman writer, who spoke of that term, of permanence as being one of the absolute cores of architecture, was speaking of a sense of emplacement, I think, that perhaps underlies all of our worlds. I come from Canada, and my sense of the world, perhaps, is not so very different than the vast plains that reach out and the desert that reaches out from this extraordinary place in the ocean that is here just a little south. The kind of confidence, a historical confidence, perhaps not one that we completely share today, but still so fundamental to our thinking, of the world which is eternally there, under our feet. The sense that this planet and this world is absolutely eternal. A kind of a delicious sense. I don't mean this just in a historical or theoretical sense. I mean, when I stand outside, not perhaps on this hollow podium, but if I stand on the ground outside, this lovely sense of being able to stand and being received and somehow relax into the earth is just such a familiar one. When I go an hour or two north from my home, I go to the wilderness north of Toronto. And in the Canadian Shield, the land has been scoured absolutely clear by the hundreds of thousands of years of ice ages that preceded the Wisconsin and Illinoisan ice ages. And the limestone has been stripped away. The turfs are long gone. And I'm standing on the bare magma, the granite underfoot. This sense of a radically solid, firm, eternally silent fundament underfoot gives the most beautiful sense of emplacement. It makes me realize, and I do wonder whether you have that sensation standing on the ground. It makes me realize that my posture most of the time is very far from that kind of certainty of being carried in the world. I think that when I stand here on this podium or perhaps on an upper floor of a building, my posture is always somehow tense, slightly qualified, because I'm floating, because I'm constantly disabled somehow by the sense of every single surface that I'm on being somehow hollow, being provisional, being temporary. What a very curious kind of sense of living in the world is imparted into our bodies, of living in cities today. If we have that classical sense of being able to rely on the ground and being at peace and resting with the solidity of the ground, where our parents are eternally alive, where our culture is solid, where our nations are secure, where the land is alive and fertile and well, then perhaps architecture has a very simple task, that is, of framing and acting as a filter and emplacing us, trying to calibrate those beautiful and eternal qualities. I wonder if I can ask what kind of responses we might have, what kind of architecture, what kind of sculpture, lyrically, we might offer to the sense today of living in a time of extinction, of living in a time of turbulence in which the surface of the earth is so radically, unspeakably insecure. I think it would be very tempting in responding with all responsibility to such an uncertain time. I think it would be very tempting to turn very early to a strategy of closing boundaries and of cutting the use of our resources to the radical minimum, and to make every single step as tightly bounded as possible, out of a sense of great responsibility, perhaps, to close things, to limit things, to worry about consuming. And perhaps all of us feel the ethic of needing to do such things. And yet, it seems to me that by closing things, we limit such possibility. I'm hungry for a very different response rather than just limiting. I do hope that the work that I'm sharing with you can give a sense of an opening and a dissipation and a very deliberate fragility that works in a very different way than that kind of closure. I think that we've been taught that clear, limited boundaries in architecture are a beautiful ethic. It's remarkable to me that something like a sphere is taken for granted as being obviously the kind of true, noble, excellent way to make architecture. Perhaps underlying the cause of minimalism, of making things as hard and clear and bounded and closed as possible, is a kind of an assumption about a primary geometry that's been with us in a Western tradition since Plato wrote his beautiful Origin of the World in the Timaeus some 2,300 years ago. He said that the origin of the world rests not in the many and not in the circumstantial, but in a kind of a transcendent, pure, distilled, single set of forms, a crystal, or perhaps even a triangle, or a dual, or a single point, a distillation. And playing that kind of thing out into architecture is a curious kind of form language that rests in the distilled language of, say, spheres and cubes and gloss-faced crystalline forms. Is a raindrop something that has a kind of moral authority in guiding our designs? I mean, I could think, what a beautiful form. I could think of the way water ripples out and rebounds. But at the same time, when I think more about this kind of form language, it seems to me that by following a reductive geometry in which there is a maximum enclosed territory and a minimum envelope, that's the geometry of a raindrop after all, or the sphere, then we have a very curious, almost perverse kind of machine for resisting interaction with the world. I mean, after all, the action of this kind of form can have no less reaction face. It's the optimal kind of resistance to interaction with the world. It's the minimum possible exposure. And so I want to oppose this raindrop. Are you with me?
Yes.
You don't really have to agree, but thank you, thank you. I hate this raindrop. Isn't it a very curious thing that if we think about design languages, that a snowflake would not be an epitome of design as opposed to a raindrop? It's a very different optimum, and it's one that I want to offer as being a countering kind of design method to the reductive, distilling Platonic language that I've been showing you just in this slide, in this previous slide. A snowflake epitomizes the maximum kind of efflorescence with the world, the maximum kind of effusion of energy, the maximum vulnerability. It's the most possible reaction face for a given amount of mass as opposed to the least. And I think it's a very curious thing that in our design education and in our system of Western values, that this kind of form language would be considered, in art historical terms, as excessive, frilly, vulnerable, corrosive perhaps, the Rococo. What a curious kind of set of values we have. So in all seriousness, I am pursuing as part of our work a kind of, as a corrective, a pursuit of a maximum efflorescence, an attitude of design which pursues unapologetically fragility and participation and exposure and opening as an excellent way to engage energy and fertility, as a completely responsible way to impart renewal to the environment. This produces then a kind of form language in which multiple sensors of flux and condensation move together with reaching out in a continual kind of refreshing churn of multiples. And I want to just move very briefly in a section towards some methods for design. I hope you're with me. I hope you don't mind my digressing on these methods for a while. I'm trying to give just a context for some of the work that we're doing. This produces the need for some new form language and some new organization as well. I love the sense that we might be able to acquire some language that speaks about complex, interrelated things that are open and constantly exchanging, such as this beautiful kind of synthetic computer projection of a weather field working in the ocean, quasi-geostrophic. Turning, strophic meaning turning, the geostrophic meaning the surface of the earth, and quasi meaning fluctuating. So a very different kind of action than a pure, bounded, firm surface, but an absolutely familiar one if we think about the action of weather or of moving through a field or of moving in water. This can be modeled, and it can be worked with very directly. And using some new software tools, it becomes possible to build up a language in which the interrelationship of many small things, each of which is dynamically relaxing and shedding its forces as opposed to trying to clutch and freeze and make things crystalline, can be something that's very directly worked with, quite precisely. It's tremendously motivating to be part of a generation where these tools become available, and they ask for a new language to be acquired as well. There's a delicious sense of being able to look at the subtlest of dimensions using new instrumentation. This is of course, the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, deep underground outside of Geneva, where the instrumentation of multiple arrays of sensors are worked with layer upon layer upon layer, looking like nothing so much as a medieval halo of a kind of a saturated space, being able to detect the subtlest of phenomena. I love the kind of possibility that this instrumentation and this new design language imparts. Now, I've been talking about perhaps some rather large scales and some rather subtle scales, but I do want to bring this home into a very tangible sense for architects and sculptors. I love the sense in this image, shared by a wonderful colleague, Michelle Addington in Yale, of a Schlieren photograph. A Schlieren photograph is a high-definition thermal photograph which has a notch filter which can very precisely look at thermal exchanges. And it reveals that there are minute convective plumes around each of our bodies, which imparts a sense of a local anatomy, of expanded physiology around our body that makes each of us a thermal pump and makes each of us an exchanging kind of weather system in our own right. Love the sense that that might be understood as a kind of place. And here you can see just a little bit more. You can even see I hope you can see the outer ripples of the energy of the sound wave itself displacing the air and that resulting in a momentary thinning and an expansion of the environment so that we can render that visible, rendering then phenomena like the heating of the hands as they momentarily impact and blood is imparted as being a kind of a coarse environment, ironically, in this space. So you can see also the local turbulence around those hands. It's just a tremendously enabling sense. Now, as a research method, we could think of working with stable environments and then using those kind of methods as a kind of a petri dish in which very delicate, fragile elements are used to line existing environments in kind of an unapologetic shelter. And then building up a momentum from that environment, it might be possible to build reflexive envelopes exposed, enhancing the performance of existing buildings. Think of solar shades on the outside of buildings. Think of modifying the local environment. And then, in turn, this could be used to expand the environment and to start to build firmament itself, start to build synthetic earth. And that could expand again and start to address the minute interchanges between dimensions in the environment, and so that a rather comprehensive sense of fertility might start to be orchestrated and built with very finely tuned kind of flux between those dimensions. This might produce a sense of an ethical involvement between people and the environment, in which there's a knowledge and a sensing and a feeling of impacts, of participating, of not simply standing in empty space, as that extraordinary Giacometti pair of sculptures upstairs implies in that existentialist mode, in which things are empty around the void, but rather in which space is full, redolent with potential, full of impacts and resonance. And perhaps that in turn might generate a sense of an architecture which is a kind of a gentle soil, framing unapologetically weakly, lining a space and making spaces for action and potency. So I've just tried to shape a kind of a manifesto for design, and I've tried to give some associations. I'd next like to give a little bit more of a sense of a grounding in art history, a reference for this kind of project, and then I'm going to move into a couple of more specific projects that we've been making. I hope it's okay to have this much kind of side-looping exploration, but I'm trying to build up a sense of a rather multiple way of looking sidelong and gathering and accumulating, a rather fertile way of working. The space that I was speaking about before, the firmitas that Vitruvius spoke of 2,000 years ago, and the solid land that I was speaking of, has a very, very long tradition. And in the Renaissance, we could call that the start of a humanist tradition, conceiving of architecture as being one of solid boundaries and clear framing of space, making a stage for human action, kind of a beautiful sense of deliberately emptying space, deliberately hardening walls, not as a prison, but rather in order to render people free. This beautiful painting by Piero Della Francesca, Flagellation of Christ, perhaps kind of epitomizes that sense of a humanist space. I love the way the floor is so very carefully worked here, this deliberately gridded perspective that's set out by Della Francesca. And then the framing of the architecture, the kind of obligatory religious scene, which is just rendered as a curious kind of side panel back in the distance, while those citizens of Florence, those young bloods standing on the floor, have such extraordinary kind of life. And I guess what I'm trying to communicate in sharing this image is a sense of one humanist conception. That is, if we have a rigid architecture, and if we have solid ground, then we get one particular kind of vision of society. And it's a beautiful vision. It's full of justice and fairness. Look at the expressions between those citizens' faces as they're discussing some kind of governance or some kind of trade deal. Look at the lovely contrapposto that frames their individual bodies, the kind of, rather than an extremely formal kind of presentation, the relaxing into a dynamic equilibrium of their frames. The kind of gentleness of that exchange is remarkable if we only look at that cluster of people alone. And yet, if we look at the floor, the gridded floor, and if we look at the boundaries of the walls, then I think that something is lost as well. This is a polarized set of relationships. Almost all relationship here, almost all energy is placed on that nuanced exchange between those peers. It's obsessed with its own kind of human society. The sky is almost entirely absent. The floor is sealed away. There are boundaries here. There's a tremendous cost, I think, of concentration of dimensions here, and the environment barely exists. Just perhaps to confirm this particular kind of way of seeing, Sandro Botticelli's lovely Annunciation painted around the same time. This is just early 1500s. It confirms the same way of framing humanist space. I love this gridded perspectival floor and the most nuanced set of exchange between the figures. I mean, remarkable. Look, Gabriel announcing to Mary with a swooning, kind of incredibly lyrical contrapposto is the most beautiful of exchanges, but made possible by the most rigid of environments. The clear portal that frames Gabriel, the gridded floor itself, the utterly conventional landscape that stretches behind them. I want to step backwards for some examples of a relationship that might suggest strategies for generating a kind of fertility, a kind of mutual relationship within the work that I am sharing with you this afternoon. And I must say that I love this image by Fra Angelico, painted just 35 years before the others or so, sorry, about 50 years before. In this Christian image, I think that we might have a kind of prototypical architecture that might be tremendously motivating. I love the way this great veil, made so very simply as a brocade, is hung and then acts as a bridge in between the kind of seething world of the garden around the perimeter and then the radiant interior anatomies of those figures. I also love the way the floor is so very turbulent in these primary clouds of material. And there's a very interesting sensibility which speaks about the way material is worked with here, that relates very directly to our own work. I want to look at this a little bit more closely. This is a Genesis story, and it's speaking about how life begins. And because it's a virgin and child, it would be natural for those kind of primary elements to be framed and to be rendered present. The ground here is so utterly different than a ground of a Vitruvian firmitas, a solid ground, or the kind of bounded social world of perspective that I was showing you in the earlier humanist paintings. What a remarkable kind of conception here. Paint here is deliberately allowed to splotch and fleck and dissolve in a liquid bed and find its own resolution. Fra Angelico is a master of figuration, completely in control of being able to achieve perspectival space or the profile of naturalistic figuration. And yet here, he's allowing paint to splotch and to splash as a kind of a spiritual exercise of deliberately not controlling. And this isn't just an isolated phenomenon. It's a remarkable kind of sensibility. Here's another enunciation from the same painter in which you can see another set of these clouds of deliberately uncontrolled, released actions. Here we can see the lovely sets of vortexes and of shifts in a set of the steps for the coronation of the Virgin. This is a painting from Philadelphia. I'm going to anchor this by looking at one more painting, trying to talk about a sense of working with this material and seeing the subtle interactions of multiple forces, so very different than the kind of rigid Platonic hold on things, by looking at one more painting by Fra Angelico, Noli me tangere, meaning touch me not. This is the Christian story in which the God appears 3 days after the crucifixion and appears to Mary Magdalene, who we can see on the left-hand side of the scene. And there's a kind of a faint shadow fissuring the garden. When we look closer, then we see stigmata on the figure on the right, just a tiny little mark on the hand, and then a chorus-like field of plants stretching out, flowers. And on every single one of those flowers is a little splotch of red as well, as if the entire thing is singing and chorusing in a kind of a sympathy for the act of the crucifixion. The stigmata is being born in every single bit of the scene. And the way those elements are rendered is quite remarkable, because if we look even more closely, the touch of the painter in imparting each one of those marks is utterly different than the act of carefully carving the lines and figuring the forms that make the main figures. Instead, each one of those marks is a splotch, is a blotch. It's the liquid pigment is released and it's allowed to crawl on the wall and just find its place. What a remarkable kind of sensibility. The term dissimilitude, of deliberately not trying to figure, not trying to impose, but rather releasing oneself to the material kind of actions of this material, is something that I find really remarkable and points in a very different direction than the kind of determined, controlling, hardening, kind of boundary-making action that we might see in the march of progress through humanist technologies and humanist images. So I really love that sensibility. We can just see one more, just confirming this sense that this is not an accident in Fra Angelico's rendering of stone itself. This is in San Marco, underneath another set of the figures, in which paint is deliberately thrown and flung and allowed to blotch. Now I'm going to give you just one more layer of thinking with one more digression. I hope that I'm not going too far in too many different directions, but I did want to weave this together. So far, what I've tried to speak to is 2 or 3 ways of thinking that generate a body of intentions and some very practical methods for working with the rather complex environments that we've been making. So far I've tried to talk about the world of sensing, a language of diffusion, a sense of connection, some new sensing apparatus, some computation that can be used, and then perhaps a tradition which stands quite different, quite remarkably differently from a humanist tradition in looking patiently at things and letting them soak in and releasing oneself to the involvement. That's the sense that I was trying to share in that last body. This sense of making a bridge between elements, expanding one's boundaries then, has some very interesting psychology that's available to underpin the mission as well. And it's a psychology which this past century has been studied by a wonderful American psychologist, Donald Winnicott, someone who has been studying the formation of the infant psyche. And if we can just think about that for a moment, we could think of the consciousness of an infant as one that doesn't yet know their name and isn't yet aware that they are a separate person, but rather is somehow coterminous with their mother's body in their first states. And in that state, in that infantile state, before the psyche is formed, we get tremendously interesting relationships. Winnicott speaks then about a transition which tries not to require infants to take responsibility and to learn right and wrong and to quickly become responsible for their actions, but rather teasing out in a very, very gentle set of playful relations the emergence of the coherence of their body and the emergence of a sense of understanding and working. And transitional objects then become very, very significant in this state. A transitional object is like a banky, a lovey. Do you remember your loveys? Did you have a banky? They were sodden, awful things as well. And Winnicott speaks very directly about bankies and loveys. Oh. And he points to this state, the sense that instead of removing and teaching and making someone responsible for something, this material is allowed somehow to exist in an exquisite liminal kind of relationship, utterly ambiguous about whether it's part of your body or part of the world. And it makes a kind of remarkable kind of psychological theater in which you can wrestle and blame and fight, or perhaps fold into yourself, perhaps be comforted by, projecting emotions into it, wrapping it around you, smelling it. Yes, smelling it. And rather than needing to clean it, and rather than needing to harden that boundary, this kind of material has a very curious kind of lingering presence. And in Winnicott's words, gradually decathects into the surrounding environment. A kind of lovely kind of dissolving, condensing, very optimistic sense of how identity could emerge, which I find just a tremendously kind of encouraging role for a conception of a renewed architecture. Now, I'll just show a little bit of method for working with some of the ideas that I've just been sharing. And then I'm going to show two projects. One grounded in couture, in some new architectural fabrics that we've been doing in collaboration, and then one, the Hylozoic Ground project in Venice. Using some of the sensing and the thermal sensing that I was describing earlier, we've been trying to design some new components which have a maximum amount of reactiveness, designed to pull energy out and to tremble and to become very deliberately unstable. By looking with high-definition thermal photography, it becomes possible to look very minutely at the actions of things and to tune them even more. And this produces, I hope, a sense of tremendous intimacy. Perhaps it could be inspired. We could think of this as a kind of an adult's version of the crafting of a transitional object, like an architectural equivalent of bankies. And so here we can just see a little series of polymer fronds, which have been very carefully cut using digital fabrication to expand. And here we're just looking, I'm just looking at the way the heat leaks out and is pulled out of my hand and runs up the tines. And I'm trying to maximize the amount of energy transfer, trying to generate something that is as reactive as possible. It's kind of a delicious sense of being able to see the traces that you make in this way. I really love this sense of being able to see that I am not alone, but rather that the environment is with me. In this series, you can see some very interesting behaviors too. My breath is blowing out into a frond here, and you can see the heat being imparted. You can see the little vortex shedding plumes that are coming out of the breath. And then that heat transfers into the frond. And then I stop breathing down here, and you'll see that the frond starts to cool. And something very interesting happens. At the very bottom right, if we look at the color of the fronds that are closest to my mouth, instead of simply returning to the room temperature, that's the light blue color, you can see that they're actually darker. And this implies that actually the cycling is something that's not simply happening like, okay, here's empty space, I put energy in, it receives it, then it goes back to the norm. Instead, it's become colder than it was before as the heat blooms out and moves into the core. And so that suggests that material is not simply an empty vessel that just receives our will and then returns into inert silence, but rather that it's primed for its own kind of recoiling exchanges. What a curious thing for a material to actually be so reactive that it would get much, much cooler than it was before I got there, pushing and pulling. It produces a really kind of remarkable sense of a live series of interactions. Here you can see some of the digital fabrication component strategies where we take sheet materials and then we clip things together and we build up quite a robust three-dimensional set of forms out of very simple individual gestures. Tuning the fronds, looking at snap fit technology to release the need for adhesion. And this then winds into quite a robust action of industrial design that goes into reactive envelopes, such as the solar decathlon house that we did a few years ago as well. Quite high performance envelopes that are outside of this talk. But here we can also see that same kind of work going into a new layer of couture, of a kind of a possibility field of clothing that's being developed with Iris van Herpen, a really lovely friend and collaborator, using those same fronds that I was just sharing, the same kind of form language that has gone into the buildings, but now making that into a kind of a provisional vestment. And these have been tuned then to have a maximum amount of trembling and vibration as a kind of a prototypical aura wrapping around a body. Here you can see then a sense of a kind of a materialized halo, a trembling kind of boundary, something very different than a clothing that's designed to cover or simply to kind of articulate one's own luxurious identity. These are thermally formed diagrid tulip-formed individual acrylic elements, which are laser cut, stretched thermally, and then clipped together using silicone joints, and making this kind of bubbling like veil that wraps around this woman. This was presented at the Pompidou last year. And here you can see some of the scale of these vestments that are generated as very much of a conversation with the architectural and sculptural scales that we've been working with before. Here's another fabric that was made just a little earlier, in which individual laser cut acrylic elements are clipped together, making this kind of boiling contemporary version of a corrugated Fortuny pleated garment, for wonderful Venetian designer of perhaps a century ago now, actually, goodness me. But the designer that made the extraordinary kind of pleated silks that have become canonical. Here, this is a version of that same material. And I'll just share a little clip so that you can see the kind of very simple action of these kind of vestments. They're framed so that they drink in kinetics, and they tremble and shift and vibrate. I'm not saying they're sit-downable. But I hope you'll bear with me as being things to at least be clothed for standing. I'll just show you a brief clip of the next one before I go on. We've been thoroughly enjoying this sense of a veil of wrapping around bodies. Here's just another one that is a very gentle cloud. And because there is a problem with sit-down ability, we're also working with injection molded polyurethane and resilient clips and making expanded garments that are very resilient and approaching ready to wear with iris, such as this leather and crystalline garment, which was certainly something that could be durable. And we really, really enjoyed the kind of translation back and forth between possibility fields and then approaching durability. Now that same kind of sensibility goes into architectural scaffolds as well. Here you can see an unclothed hyperbolic scaffold making a ceiling that went into a series of installations. It's using hyperbolics. Hyperbolics are simply doubly curved surfaces, and they're made by individual elements such as, here I'll just back up, individual elements which are something a bit like crocheting, in which you crochet many, many links together and clip elements together, and then if you cram another link into the row, then it will start to swell. And so that then you'll move into doubly curved surfaces and warped surfaces. So you could think of this as deliberately bad crocheting. Here's the section drawing, a cut through the other way, where you can see how that kind of structure then is clothed with mechanisms. And the individual links are very carefully drawn so that they use snap fit. That is, the individual material has a bit of resilience in it, and by drawing it so it's just a little bit smaller than the actual mouth that it needs to mate with, then it can be forced into position, and then it'll clip, and then we don't need adhesion at all. We can have a complete kind of interlinking system. And that then is woven together into quasi-periodic tessellations. A tessellation is just a quilt-making field, and a quasi-periodic tessellation means something that doesn't quite rigidly repeat, but rather has some hiccups in it and some shifts, producing a great resilience. And then that's clothed in turn with layers of mylar or other translucent veils, and then that's clothed in turn by glasswork and vessels and glands and traps in order to make a soil-like fabric, which is quite rich. This work then is organized in multiple layers of structure, and then the computational systems which hold it together. I'm just going to skip past this because it's taking a little bit long. And then it's organized in these series of layers which make the great turfs, gentle hovering turfs, soils that make the gentle environments that I've been describing. And here we can see the hyperbolic scaffolds above that I was just speaking about, and a suspended filtering layer below, which then passes signals all along it and reacts to you. Now, I hope that you can see this as a kind of an architecture. It's clogged up, of course, and it's cloud-like, but if we compress these layers together, then I hope that you might agree with me that this might make quite a durable and functional canopy or breathing wall for an architecture of the future. Very, very definitely framing public space and making space for exchanges. The individual elements, the mylar fronds that I was speaking of earlier, make gentle valves by cutting them very deliberately to release the curling forces within the mylar material. And by multiplying those valves by the 1,000-fold and the 10,000-fold, you get the equivalent of a kind of material pumping system, because those kind of valves can push and lock in one direction and release if they go in the other direction. So you have the equivalent of a great breathing machine that harvests the air movements around you. They also have glands and traps that pull material into them and that start to feed themselves. And then, as we were looking at earlier, they also have a deliberate trembling quality that harvests vibrations. These systems are organized in multiple nesting loops of communication chains, tribes of individual mechanisms that will speak to each other through the exchanges of signals using microprocessors, and then those tribes then are organized to speak to each other as well. And so you get very large chorus-like chirping fields, waving fields of interactions as those signals are passed from part to part to part. And here you can see kind of a storm-like environment happening at the Sydney Biennale when we had those filters and those sensors tuned a little bit too high, and so the elements are kind of lurching out of control in this one. In a new generation of computation, I'm just going to focus on this last project before I wrap up. I want to share a new machine operation. I've been sharing with you a sense of reflexive responsive environments in which there are sensors that track you and responses that can move back and produce a kind of rippling, breathing environment. But in this new organization, we have overlapping organizations in which curiosity, machine learning, is imparted in sets of microprocessors as well. And so the environment starts to experiment and try on behaviors and values its own acquisition of information, really winding up the sense of exchange with you. This is organized by having multiple layers of sensors which are interconnected in networks, and then organizing them together with a computational system that has its own memory, sets of memories, and then abilities to remember what has happened already and to compare that with some predictive models. And by having many, many individual clusters that are organized that way, you get a very, very interesting kind of set of behaviors. Here I'm just showing you the organization of many of those nodes working around individual clusters of space, and then the larger kind of fields making fabrics, interconnected fabrics, that organize the entire system. And just to show you a little bit of the first experimental work, this is current work for us. We're looking at just one of the elements, and if you picture this multiplied many, many times into new fabrics. Now what's happening here is the individual mechanisms and sensors are machinically experimenting with possible actions and then comparing it with what was predicted. And I think that we could compare this to perhaps the action that you would see when a baby colt is first born, and the first actions of just it trying to struggle to its feet, you see a remarkable kind of trembling of its limbs, a slightly spastic kind of action. Perhaps in a human baby, we see this same kind of semi-coherent behavior, a very curious set of behaviors. And my understanding is that there are individual sets of coherence as bundles of muscle groups, and the neural organization that connects them acquires its own reflex coherence. And then greater levels of coherence arrive after that. And this set of behaviors then produces a really kind of delicious, delicate, vulnerable sense of exchange, a very different sense than we might expect when we speak about our expectations of a responsive architecture. Certainly not one which does our bidding, certainly not one that necessarily serves us automatically, but perhaps one that can lay the groundwork for finding mutual relationships which feel sensitive and which feel playful and which are full of fertility. Now, I've just made a tour through a set of works, and I've tried to describe some work in motion. So I'll just sum up. I've tried to speak about intimacy and touch and building a sense of world out of fragility. I've tried to talk about vestment and couture as a kind of possibility field of a new set of skin which is deliberately fragile and which intersects with the world. I've complained about raindrops. And I've advocated instead snowflakes. Okay. No, I have, actually. I mean it. The sense that a diffusive form language and an efflorescence might serve as a very effective new design language, contesting the kind of prevailing Platonic geometries, which says that something must be pure and reduced and have automatically clear boundaries, is something that I do hope that I've persuaded you that has some merit and offers some quite valuable qualities for contemporary architecture. I've tried to amalgamate that into a kind of a manifesto for design by expanding boundaries. And then I've tried to describe through rather patient craft how using digital fabrication, using structural scaffolds, using textile-like organizations that are resilient and that are force-shedding and that are quite tough and that can handle many, many different forces, a very substantial new reactive architecture can be built. I've tried to describe a kind of behavior which is not necessarily one which does our bidding, but which produces a sympathetic environment, a resonance, an empathy, which might impart behaviors in this coming architecture. A gentle, breathing presence, a mutual presence. And I've tried to talk about how, by weaving those different elements together, very substantial soil-like fields with tremendous fertility might be possible. This then, I hope, might serve as an example of some public spaces that might be possible and that might speak for a way for things to become living tomorrow. So I hope that serves as a kind of a contribution to a practice that ultimately speaks about standing on the earth and offering a sense of possibility. So I hope that this is a contribution. Thank you. I would be very happy to take questions. Sure.
I was the orientation of your research, and I'm fascinated by your teaching us to be resistant to the draw report approach to success. And I'm asking you, in any of the experiences that are available to the public, experimentation in the recognition is there in your installation for us to observe and react.
That's a really interesting, provocative question. I'm hearing the question being one of probing the recklessness or open nature of these sculpture and architectural environments, and I take you as perhaps asking about the fragility, perhaps, or the possibility for great turbulence and kind of wild qualities to happen in them. Well, and the independence
Of the reaction.
and the independence of the reactions. So, if we looked at this material on the surface, we might say, oh my goodness, how on earth would you take care of it? It's just, a group of teenage hooligans are going to run through and they'll simply destroy it, and then the dream will be over, and we'll be back to our good, strong Vitruvian subway stations, with their good ceramic tiles and the firm grounds. However, this work has been now seen by many people. It's been in very public places. The exhibitions count about 5 million people that have been through now, because some of them have been quite public. And some of the layers are very, very close at hand and are touchable, and others are naturally canopies and are positioned in secure ways. The ones that are touchable have some very interesting qualities to them, I mean, in the sense of surviving. One is that they are actually quite tough. In fact, if you make something deliberately rigid, people will kick it, and it will need repair anyway. If you create dynamic force shedding, if you use a textile, for example, textiles can be incredibly strong because each thread is supported by the next thread is supported by the next, and they give way, and then the whole starts to support the thing. And so there's a buffering action and absorbing that means the individual kinds of violence actually can be handled very well by the material. Of course, you have to be practical about using some tough materials, but those structures are really tenacious in the way they behave. So on the physical side, there are some simple design principles like the textile fields that offer great confidence. But something more than that happens as well. There's a curious kind of convivial sharing that seems to happen in environments where you're encouraged to touch and to explore and to share. Perhaps it comes from the calibration of the spaces so that they are oriented to small groups of people as well as large crowds. Perhaps it comes from the open detailing. I mean, it's not completely Wild West. You know, these are rather gentle places that these are put in. But it's a very curious kind of social interchange in which there will be a child exploring and a parent will support that, and then someone else will see that and they'll teach their kids how to behave as well, and somebody will just call out and point to something, or maybe protect it or encourage someone. And this is a whole set of orientation which is very different than the kind of signposting and rule setting that might bound an environment in a traditional sense. It's a remarkably resilient, active communication that I see being fostered in these places, which is on a very practical level. I mean, I mean this literally, that they've survived very, very well through a kind of community of exchanges. So that would suggest that the environments can facilitate a kind of stewardship and nurturing as well.
Well, what it does when you think about design to counter earthquakes through architectural, structural modifications.
Well, design for earthquake handling is an excellent example. I absolutely agree with you. If we look, for example, at vernacular Asian detailing, where the forces of an earthquake are absorbed through multiple loose joints, as opposed to something that is stiff as possible. So there does have to be some tolerance for a certain amount of shedding. You know, I mean, like akin to walking through a forest, and there is some consumption that can be readily handled through kits of parts and through just some levity and some wise decision making. And degrees of touch and degrees of participation are a continuous gradient in any case. I mean, you can make those decisions along the way. But I guess the point would be that there's a vastly larger gradient of possible access than traditional judgments would hold. If this has vulnerability, it does so in a way that is not simply a sitting duck. Actually, it's more kind of like the tenacity of weeds, you know, and goats, and things which are actually pretty tough, and they can handle it.
It's kind of like Beesley and Calgary. It's kind of like snow skiing through the Canadian Rockies, cross country. And you leave in tracks, but when you turn around, the snow has covered your tracks up. It's rebuilt. So it's kind of a situation where everything's so pretty, the snow's falling. You're paying attention to the beauty. You don't really want to mess it up because it's too pretty. But you worry about your tracks, but when you look back, they're gone too. It's filled with snow. So it reminds you of like you cross country.
That's a really nice analogy.
Kind of a living environment.
I like that.
In the beginning of your talk, you probably imply a little bit, I would like to ask again. So we want to design these reactive living spaces using bio-inspired or biomimic materials. Is it a response that actually we are giving that? You said that the era of extinction, which is definitely happening in our lifetime. Is it really a response that we want to create this kind of a biological or artificial places resembling biological responses where we live? Why not incorporate? Why not we preserve the nature and actually put the nature in our spaces more?
This work starts with a reverence about nature. And sanctuaries are an absolute necessity and limits are an absolute necessity. But I teach a division of architecture now in parallel to my sculpture practice in Waterloo, which is dedicated to achieving carbon neutral cities. And we try to count carbon. And the methods of closing down and making zero trace camping kind of buildings, the equivalent of that, can achieve, those strategies of closing and preserving can yield 10, 20, 30% greater efficiency. Similarly, tracts of land and forests can make a certain contribution and a certain integrity. But those kind of increments absolutely pale in comparison to the numbers that are required here. The numbers for achieving viability in terms of an exchange of oxygen and self-renewal require transformation and not simply increments. And the danger is that if we make a forest reserve, or if we have a good energy efficient lead platinum building, that we'll get complacent and we'll think we've done our part and then our lives will continue. And so actually, I have a reverence for the mission of limiting and of respecting and creating sanctuaries, but I believe it simply is, as a set of strategies, is incapable of meeting the need for creating fertility itself, resource positive environments. Where life abounds, as opposed to we just get through it, So in parallel with that, this work is not so much biomimetic as it tries to look at some natural processes and learn from them, but work with quite unapologetically synthetic means. A form is a diagram of forces. It has action. It works in particular ways, and you can produce the most lovely subtlety by tracing things that way methodically. Just as any weaver or potter knows by working through with intense involvement with materials, seeing all of the information that's there in the combination of working with our senses and with new tools. So this is by no means kind of a manifesto that's trying to say wholesale new technology is going to be a solution. It's rather a kind of a weave, a much more kind of ambivalent kind of weave of different processes. But anyway, I want to respond with all respect to the making of sanctuaries. It's just that it seems that it's quite inadequate to answer the questions that befall us.
Just curious, you did not specifically list out a range of practical benefits to what you're achieving, i.e. air purification, higher insulation levels, things like that. Number one. But number two, if in fact there is some goal on the practical side, might it not be more simply achieved via using fiberglass paint with some sensors and or micromotors involved, and you get 90% of whatever benefit at a fraction of the complexity or manufacturing costs?
Well, that's a perfectly fair nuts and bolts question. I kind of hear you calling the bluff of the thing. Okay, so, what's it cost? How much does it weigh? Why can't we do it? And this work combines hypothesis making and new technologies. The craft of hypothesis making is something that's really very undernourished in science and engineering. Engineering and science tends to start after questions are formed. And this work instead is trying to make a contribution by looping back and forth, by experimenting with sketches, testing them out to get some grounding in, in real material involvement, just like a craft person, the thing folds, it actually hinges, look at how that material ages, look at how it works, that kind of absolutely concrete involvement, but then loops back into the making of new prototypes. And so what that produces is a slightly mongrel kind of hybrid field here in which you have a combination of many of the layers which are working functionally and which even could be patentable and could go to market, but other ones which are sort of unapologetically iconographic, I mean, like they're sketches in which there are things that could occur, but they aren't working yet. And yet the ingredients are there and they're kind of waiting for the right thing to come together in the right circumstance, and then new qualities will start to take over. And so this kind of space, you could say it mixes fiction and fact. And I want to make a defense for that, rather than that being kind of like an expose or, sorry, I mean, if we think of a traditional role for architecture, for example, imagine a Gothic cathedral. Imagine standing in the middle of a town and the town square in front of it, and part of that kind of lovely work would be framing gloriously with some very strong technology, reaching as high as it possibly can and needing every bit of discipline in order to work. But part of it also would be a west front, which sets out a cosmology, which sets out a picture of where we are going and where we have come from, and might be framed around the most glorious rose window, which frames the filtering of light and gives us an image, a kind of way of relating to the world. And that would be to suggest that part of that work is purely symbolic. Or let's say it's symbolic, and then parts of those gestures start to work and carry function, and we take those symbols seriously. And so we say a symbol is a way of making a world. And if we live with those images, we will find those means of creating the world. There's a continual cycling back and forth of possibility making and technology. Now, this work is much more of a kind of a gentle field. It's not a cathedral, but I do think it combines those practices, and I want to stand for that rather than apologizing for it. I think making a fiction has tremendous consequence, and I hope that by bringing these things cheek and jowl together, that something quite potent might be possible.
May I make one more comment by Hagen thoughts here? My first response to you was a soft tone of your language, like a guru almost, giving us the information in a gentle form. And I go away thinking of you as an architect of the potential of the abstraction as a quality in architecture. I can say that. And to accelerate some of the abstraction that your thinking brings to the possibilities. Is abstraction the word? Possibilities. It's the theory of possibilities and flexibilities in architecture.
That's a really lovely way to speak about abstraction. Actually, I mean, I really respect what that offers.
It's virtuous, I think. And that's the whole purpose, I think, of a lot of what we're experiencing from there.
Is there time for another? I think there was one more question. I don't want to. Oh, shall we bring it out to the drinks now? Thank you.